With Lesson 12, we're going to turn our attention to literature published primarily in the 20th and 21st century. This is a turn we're taking for the final 4 lessons. After starting way back with mythology, going up through the Renaissance and the Victorian period, and the second unit, with this final unit, we're going to look at really things that were published really recently. Again, to give you kind of a wide sampling of literature, and also to see where literature has come. What are the current trends? How are these similar to and different from the trends that came before? Lesson 11, we looked at critical theory, and I placed critical theory at that position in the curriculum because critical theory, the way it's practiced now, as I explained in the last lesson, is really a phenomenon of the 20th and 21st centuries. So a key difference between the authors we'll be looking at today and all the authors who came before is the advent of critical theory as a popular movement that's practiced at academic universities happened in between the two. So some of those big critics we talked about, Derrida, Foucault, etc., these authors we're reading from this point forward have knowledge of those critics, whereas the authors we read before did not. So that'll be a key difference going forward to think about changes in trends in literature. An important concept that has been around really as long as people have existed, but has really only begun to be talked about in literary studies in the last 30 or 40 years is the concept of the other. Obviously, just like it sounds, just the word the other refers to any being, any entity other than oneself. However, once you start to think about culture, nationality, race, class, gender, etc., that concept of the other becomes much more complicated than just something that is other or separate from oneself. It can become a term that's utilized to describe an entire group of people, and this is the practice of othering or otherizing. One of the things that happened with the advent of literary criticism as widely used phenomenon at universities is more talk about the canon and what texts go into the canon. And until the 1980s, really, it was primarily older white men making these decisions and white male authors going into the canon. And in the 1980s, when some of the more recent movements in critical theories such as feminism, Marxism, etc. came about, then the canon started to be more diversified. It's still not very diversified, but it's getting better. And so the concept of the other becomes very important then. I mean, it's always important, but it's important starts to be recognized then. How is an individual constructed as an otherized figure? And what is the other's relationship to society tell us about that society? These are some of the important questions that emerge. Now, the other, this concept of the other, can come about just about anywhere in any way. And later in the lesson, we'll talk about some kind of the wider implications of that. But it's talked about the most primarily in the field of post-colonial studies. So what we're going to do with this lesson is take that concept of post-colonial studies that was touched on briefly with all the other critical fields in the last lesson and look at it a little more in depth. The reason I assigned the introduction from Edward Said's Orientalism is in many respects he's considered the father of post-colonial studies. The only other author to really go in depth with post-colonial studies that predates Said is Frantz Fanon, who I believe I mentioned in the last lecture, but he was doing more psychoanalysis, gender studies, sexual studies types of things that kind of bordered into post-colonial studies. Said is the one who, when he publishes Orientalism in 1978, the publication of that text, which you read the introduction to, is really kind of the declaration, so to speak, the Declaration of Independence type statement for scholars who study post-colonial studies. Fanon wasn't as aware what he was doing, how it bordered into post-colonial discussions as much. Said is one who says, this is important, we need to talk about it, and openly identifies that. So, in many ways, he's considered the father of post-colonial studies. Some of the other post-colonial critics I mentioned last time, Gayatri, Spivak, and Homi Bhabha, they come along just a little bit later. So we're going to look at Said and how he discusses the concept of the other, and then see how it plays out in the text, the literary text for this lesson. So Orientalism was published in 1978, and like I said, it launched this field. It was kind of that manifesto of these are the important issues, we should be talking about them. But what is Orientalism? What does that title refer to? You may think of it as an academic discipline, because for decades, if not centuries, before Said published his book, Orientalism was the study of the Orient at academic universities, and it was the field of studying the Orient was actually referred to as Orientalism. So Said takes this term and kind of plays with it a bit. One of the reasons he does that is the term Orient and Orientalism is problematic from the get-go. What countries comprise the Orient? If you're saying someone is Oriental or from the Orient, what does that mean? Well, it can encompass any number of regions, including East Asia, Southern Asia, the Middle East, Palestine, etc. And so Said, he says that kind of from the get-go, that people are lumping all of these very diverse and different countries together into one big, broad category, and to a certain extent saying it's all the same. So Said takes the term Orientalism and says it's not just an academic discipline, it's a discourse. And that word discourse is a bit complicated, but in the last lesson with Foucault, we talked about the way Foucault describes and defines a discourse. And for Foucault, a discourse represents knowledge and power. A discourse produces knowledge, and that knowledge gives certain individuals power. So the discourse for Foucault is rigid and interlocking, and it's difficult to penetrate. It's very powerful. So Orientalism, according to Said, is a Foucauldian discourse. Why do I have the word Taco Bell on there? Well, think about it. If I say I'm going to eat Mexican food for lunch, that could mean I'm going to Taco Bell. That could mean I'm going someplace else. Especially in Arizona, we have a lot of places that offer what some people might call more authentic versions of Mexican food than Taco Bell. And so when we think of countries or nations or cultures that we don't know perhaps as much about as our own, because we don't know anyone from there, we haven't lived there, we don't have much knowledge of it on our own, we do have ideas about that place. And those ideas are constructed by culture and society. So if you don't know much about Mexico or China, from first-hand experience, I might ask you, what do you know about them? And the things about those countries, and the things you might tell me might be things you've learned from textbooks you read in class, or even from restaurants you've eaten at, or what products are on the grocery aisle, or on the aisle in the grocery store that's marked Asian or Hispanic. So that knowledge that we get from textbooks and from other sources that isn't based on our own experience, that knowledge is created by culture, it's created by academics and everyone else who claims to have some kind of knowledge or some kind of idea of this place, and it's put out there. And that constitutes the discourse about that place. If I mention Ireland, people probably immediately think of St. Patrick's Day and green beer and other things like that. But if you go to Ireland, is that really what it's like? Are those really the most significant things for Irish people, etc.? And so what Said argues here when he talks about Orientalism is that this discourse has grown up around all the countries in the Orient that says all of these countries and places are the same, and this is what they're like. And it's tough then to offer any other kind of knowledge that's different from that popular discourse. But what does this discourse describe the countries? What is, if the discourse describes those countries, what does it characterize them like? Well, what it inevitably does is it creates an us and them dichotomy. So if you have a big kind of broad generalization of a place, without much specificity or nuance, there's usually some kind of opposite. So the Orient is obviously in the East, so East versus West, and Said uses the term Occident as kind of the opposite of the Orient. So the British were the countries, the British was the empire that primarily colonized countries in the area that's referred to as the Orient, much of Africa and Asia, the Middle East. So the Occident encompasses, most of Western Europe and the Western world, but Said's, he talks about France and the U.S., etc., but a lot of that colonization was Britain. And so Britain, or the West, Western Europe, is constructed as the opposite. The things the discourse says are characteristic of the East and of the Orient. The opposite things are characteristic of the West. This creates an us and them dichotomy. It's a binary relationship. Remember what I said about binaries? So what inevitably happens is this Occident or this East becomes the other to the West. The East or the Orient becomes the other to the West or the Occident. And so a lot of sometimes idealized, but mainly negative, always condescending traits emerge. The other, the Eastern Oriental other, is characterized as primitive, uncivilized, barbaric, savage, exotic. So a sexual element comes in there. Primitive, uncivilized, barbaric, savage, those are all kind of similar terms that are all not the same, is why I list them all, but similar terms used to describe people who are seen as inferior because their technology may not be advanced, or they may not wear as much clothes, or they may eat different types of food that to Westerners seem unclean. And then exotic is, again, kind of a sexual thing. This person is seen as just an object, not a real person, but an object of desire because they're different. And then three other very specific types of otherization are effeminate. The men from the East are almost always, or very often, described as effeminate compared to Westerners in Orientalist discourse. They're also infantilized. They're treated like children, which gets spun sometimes as a positive thing because it's not necessarily as abruptly negative, but it's very condescending when you're describing adult individuals as being childlike. And then, of course, animalistic. Not being able to control one's impulses, behaving like an animal. These stereotypes, these negative stereotypes that come about, are all a matter of perception, right? Foods that we eat that we're used to eating, when we contrast those with other foods, they may seem unclean, but it's just a matter of perception. They seem unclean to us, but that's because we haven't been exposed to them before. People in that part of the world may wear less clothes. And Orientalists may say, well, that's uncivilized, that's barbaric to not cover oneself up. But a lot of those places it's very hot. And so when that doesn't come into the thought process, then something is missed, and it's a matter of perception that ends up causing this part of the world to be perceived in a very negative way. And so typically the descriptors for the East or the Orient are very condescending, very negative, and thus through the us and them dichotomy and the otherization of Easterners, the West and the Occident comes across as very positive, very civilized, the pinnacle of civilization at the heart of the empire that rules over the East. So hopefully this makes sense here of what the discourse of Orientalism is and how otherization is a key process in that. So from Said's work here, the field of post-colonial studies takes off. Said is criticized for a lot of things. We don't have time to go into all of them here. mainly people ask, well, what is the real Orient like? Is there any way out of this discourse? If we strip it away, what's actually there that's more authentic? And as I talked about in the first lesson, concepts such as what is real or what is authentic are very problematic. So that's certainly one issue. The thing I would say, though, the key difference, the key way to think of it is, Said's critique says that Orientalism characterizes the East as monolithic. Everyone there is primitive, uncivilized, barbaric, savage, etc. Certainly, some people may be. The important thing to take away is we can't allow that to be the only view. There has to be room for other narratives, other stories that tell a different tale. Room for specificity and nuance rather than a monolithic depiction. And so post-colonial studies typically refers to any study of the relationship between a formerly colonized country and the country that colonized it. As I mentioned before, the British Empire, when it reached its height just before World War II, was the largest empire in the history of the world, even bigger than the Roman Empire. And so, along those lines, you have this lasting influence, right? After World War II, Britain's resources expended. They can't really maintain their empire. Some of the major colonies, India gains its independence in 1947, Nigeria a little bit later, and so on and so forth until the empire is no longer vast. And so what happens? Once the country gains independence, you can't simply go back to the way it was before because you've had another country ruling there for perhaps hundreds of years. So what is that post-colonial country like after that? And the relationship is ongoing even if the one country's not still ruling the other one. So as these countries went through the process of decolonization, a lot of texts emerged, and we're going to look at a few of those today. And so post-colonial studies simply refers to the study of those types of texts. They certainly all don't necessarily engage the idea of Orientalism or what is more broadly now referred to as colonial discourse, but it was kind of the launching point that got people to think about and look at these texts. So we're going to look at 3 of them today, and then we're going to look at a 4th text that does not have to do with a decolonized country, but still greatly engages the concept of otherness, because while post-colonial studies has kind of become the home of the concept of the other, it's certainly more widely applicable than that. So I did want to throw one extra text on there to show how it's more widely applicable, that concept of the other. And that's why your discussion question is broken into 2 parts. For the 3 post-colonial stories, you just need to pick one, but then I would like everyone to address the 4th and final story as the second part of the question. The first piece we have, and these post-colonial ones go in chronological order, publication date, is Hanif Qureshi's The Rainbow Sign. Now, I have done a lot of research and study into post-colonial work, but not necessarily into the pronunciation of names. So if I mispronounce any names here, please forgive me if you know the correct pronunciation. And this is a little bit different. The next 2 pieces, next 3 really, are very traditional narrative structure for short stories, but it's a short story, but it's not a short story the way we typically think of it. It's beyond just semi-autobiographical. It's very autobiographical. Late in the story, Qureshi talks about how he thought about referring to himself in the 3rd person, but then just decided to opt for the 1st person. So it lacks the traditional narrative, with an exposition, a rise, a climax, a fall, a resolution. But it does have kind of narrative elements. This isn't his biography. This isn't the story of Qureshi's life from birth to death. It's several snapshots of his life that tell us a lot about what was going on around him the way a story would. You might call this creative nonfiction. So it's our one kind of look at something a little bit different into that creative nonfiction genre. Uh, so immediately, the beginning of the narrative, Krishy introduces one of the most important concepts to studying the other and studying post-colonial um, stories, which is two nations, right? Britain, the colonizer, and then Pakistan, the former colony. And because his one of his parents, his mother is British and his father is Pakistani, he's of mixed birth, and that's immediately difficult for him growing up. And so the different sections in the story are titled England, Pakistan. And he goes back and forth between the two, which is a common theme you see in a lot of these works. And so the driving force, or what I would say the central struggle of this story is that Qureshi is constantly torn between these two places. Which one does he really belong to? That's a question he pursues. Early on in the first part, when he's still in England, he talks about Enoch Powell, who's a figure most of you probably aren't familiar with. You probably don't know too many people named Enoch, though, and there's a clear reason why. In the 1960s, Enoch Powell was a very outspoken politician in England, clearly racist, but whose ideas at the time were fairly widely accepted. His speech, which Qureshi references directly here, the famous Rivers of Blood speech, where he's referring directly to Pakistanis, as Qureshi says, but also, I believe, other members of former British colonies immigrating to England. After decolonization, many, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of immigrants from the former colonies immigrated to England, and this stirred things up, so to speak, to say the least. He basically said that if we allow, the question the politicians were debating at the time was, do we allow members of the former colonies to come to England? They weren't born in England, but they're British citizens. And so the conservative side, didn't want to allow them in. And Enoch Powell's speech is famous because of the very emotional, vivid allusion to the River Tiber from mythology and it overflowing with blood, basically saying there'd be so much conflict if we allow members of the former colonies to immigrate. There'll be so much conflict that their rivers will run over with blood. And so it's this very famous speech that's often cited as this very this very major incident of racism. And so it's happening as Qureshi's growing up here, as a child of one of these immigrants, but with a British-born mother. So, Powell is getting right at the heart of what Qureshi's struggling with. So this pushes Qureshi as a young man to take down the posters of popular British rock bands from the 60s he has on his wall and start to put up posters of Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. And what you had in the late 60s that he references here is this very kind of militant embrace of Islamic beliefs. And the response to white racism was to embrace Islam to almost a hyperbolic extent, to wear the Islamic religion like a badge of honor, almost in a violent way. And Qureshi also talks about James Baldwin, who's a great African-American novelist, who was clearly opposed to this level of militant action, obviously opposed to racism, but believing, that everyone should be equal, whereas some of the people Qureshi talks about here, like the Black Panthers, to the extent it almost became the reverse. Qureshi argues here by citing Baldwin that almost reverse racism against, the white race, rather than arguing for all people being equal. So eventually these factors kind of push Qureshi to visit Pakistan, and the second section deals with his time in Pakistan. And one thing you see here that's really interesting is the pervasive influence of British culture. People in Pakistan are almost seen more British than British people because, they've been taught to read English from the time of colonization. The Indian subcontinent where Pakistan is located hasn't been free from colonization for much more than 20 or 30 years here. So that influence is still pervasive. It's still pervasive today. And so it's interesting, he goes to Pakistan and then sees all, England's influence there after he's left England. He talks about the U.S. too while he's in Pakistan and the heroin trade, which is an example, he says, of reverse imperialism, because the heroin gets exported to the U.S. and then, wreaks havoc there. The U.S. not necessarily having colonized Pakistan, but being a country that has gone out and colonized, although not to the extent of Britain. And of course, he gives examples of people being addicted to heroin in Pakistan. So it's reverse imperialism, he mentions. An important thing he mentions once he gets back to England in the third section is the commonalities between racism and class separation. He interacts with some of these elitist characters who aren't seeing the similarities here, that it's not just about an oppression of a race, going back to the Black Panthers and that idea that it's not about suppressing one race and power of the other is not the answer, because all people should be equal. And so oppression of the lower classes and the working classes, he's saying here, is not that different than racism, because these are all people. These people are suffering too. And so it's a really important point he makes there. Toward the end of the story, he talks about the distance and closeness of England and Pakistan. Obviously a great physical distance, but because of that colonial relationship, they will always be close. There will always be people from each country immigrating to the other one, and the influence of cultural products, ideas, etc., going back and forth between the two, impacting, influencing one another, seeing some of Pakistan in England and some of England in Pakistan. And this really gets at the heart of the post-colonial experience. What I've learned, I would say one of the most important things I've learned in my work with post-colonial studies, is that the colonial experience in life after colonization is an experience that is, unless you've lived through it, is an experience which I have not. But what I've gathered from reading about it is that it's an experience that one cannot understand unless they've lived through it. And there's this kind of mysterious element to it where the two countries mingle through the process of colonization, and neither one is the same afterwards. And Homi Bhabha, who's another famous post-colonial critic, probably the second most famous one after Said, uses the term hybridity to describe this experience, that these two countries become joined in a way where something new is produced from this merger that will never be the same. And that's, to go back to deconstruction and binaries, that's kind of the third term, or the way around this us and them dichotomy is. In constructing the us and them dichotomy, both places merge through that process, and something new, something hybrid is produced. And you can't really describe, I've gained somewhat of understanding of it, but you can't really understand it without living it. And Qureshi does a really good job, though, I think, of describing it to readers when he describes his visits to England and Pakistan and the simultaneous distance and closeness of the two. Finally, I should mention the symbolism of a title. For a story that's very straightforward and not so much a story, but kind of just the author talking about his experiences, it has a very symbolic title. Obviously, the allusion to the rainbow that appears in the Bible after Noah's voyage. So question I would ask is, why would he give this story such a symbolic title when it's a very straightforward piece? Obviously, Noah's pilgrimage ends after the whole earth is covered by water and wiped out. So perhaps his journey as a child of two nations has ended, or is never ending, or supposed to symbolize the post-colonial experience, something along those lines. I'm not sure, but it's a topic worth exploring further, either in the discussion board post or a paper if you're really interested in this story. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's story, The Headstrong Historian, is a very what I would say traditional post-colonial story in terms of how it engages the us and them dichotomy in the relationship between colonizer and colonized. So the differences between Western culture and Eastern culture, as well as those perceived perceptions of Eastern culture that are perpetuated by Orientalism, become clear immediately in her story. The best example I have here is being naked. When the missionaries come, they say that the colonials are sinful because they don't wear as much clothes. And when the main character sends her son to school because she wants him to learn English, the missionaries immediately put more clothes on him, and when he comes home, she immediately takes them off. She talks about the burning heat. And that description to me, when I read this story, is so vivid, because you think about all the stereotypes. When you think about Orientalism, and hopefully as you're reading these stories and going through this lesson, you start to think about, oh yeah, I've always thought that, I've always known that about Eastern culture. I never thought about it now, about it being a negative stereotype. And that's okay. I mean, Said says that Orientalism is so pervasive that it's impossible not to participate in it, and we almost always don't realize we're participating in it. We can't really escape it, but becoming more aware of it, we can open our eyes to new stories and new narratives. So it's a really common stereotype. You see it in the movies everywhere, that people from these Eastern countries are stereotyped as being primitive and savage and sinful because they don't wear as much clothes. And then you have this story where the protagonist is talking about how her son, once he's dressed up in more clothes by the missionaries, is burning hot, and so he can't wait to get those clothes off. And that, to me, is this great insight into how a negative stereotype grows, and there's a very valid explanation that doesn't have to do with one's level of civilization or sinfulness. An explanation that doesn't have to do with those things, of why they would dress or not dress that way. So it's a great example of Adichie here challenging, an Orientalist idea. And you get other examples like that throughout the story because of the perspective of Ngamba, the narrator. Or she's not really the narrator. It's third-person narration, and the perspective shifts a few times, but it's mainly her perspective. And so things that would seem weird or strange to us, this is another way Adichie kind of challenges Orientalist discourse. Things in the story that would seem strange or alien or other to us are normal for her. And the Western customs she sees that those of us who live in the West would think of as normal seem very strange. And Adichie really does a good job of describing things that way, so you really feel like you're coming at this from Ngwamba's perspective and seeing these things that we might think are normal as other. Kind of flipping the binary, so to speak. At one point in the story, Ngwamba is contemplating, when she can't conceive a child, if her husband should take a second wife, which is very normal in that society, again, to give an example of the last point. But she doesn't want to because of the strong bond she feels with him. But one of the families her friend recommends he can marry someone from is the Okonkwo family. Okonkwo is a famous name in literary studies because he's the protagonist of a novel called Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. And Achebe's novel, Things Fall Apart, is often cited as the first post-colonial novel, like Adichie's story, also set in Nigeria. And if you go even further back, a lot of you probably haven't heard of Things Fall Apart, but Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness takes place in Nigeria and is often cited as, it's a colonial text by a white author, not a post-colonial text, but is one of the first novels to really engage the issues of colonization and that relationship. And there's certainly some very colonial views expressed in it, but also some anti-colonial views. And so Achebe in Things Fall Apart kind of engages Heart of Darkness and responds to it, and then Adichie carries on that tradition here by engaging both. And she references Okonkwo to kind of make that apparent to literary critics, again, because unlike Conrad, who wrote Heart of Darkness, she's aware of all the critical study of literature, and so she's doing things a little more directly. Still subtle, but evoking, the reference to Things Fall Apart directly. And so all of these stories, Heart of Darkness, Things Fall Apart, The Headstrong Historian deal with England or another colonial power coming into Nigeria and interacting with the locals. And they each handle it a little bit differently. I wish I had time now to go into how the other ones do, but you should read them if you have time. Another important theme here is the power of language, especially the English language. Ngwamba does not want her son to become at all like the Westerners, but she wants him to learn English because she believes he can beat his uncles in court if he knows English. So English, once the English colonizer comes in, the English language becomes incredibly powerful, and you see it with the names. Where the names of the characters, the African names, are changed to English names, and Ngwamba desperately wants her children and grandchildren to retain their African names, and the colonizers immediately change the names as one method of showing their power. So the English language, especially through names, is very powerful. Again, the significance of the title, because at the end you have Ngwambo's granddaughter, who's the character she's kind of always wanted to find, writing this revisionist history. You see the first textbook that's written and referenced by title here is being, just from the title you can tell it's a very kind of Orientalist telling of Nigerian history. And then you have the one written by Grace, who in the end eventually takes on the African name that Ngwamba always wanted for her. You have that text, which is with kind of the reverse title. So this is kind of Adichie's final last dig at Orientalism in the text, when you have this revisionist history written. And in a way, I think Adichie herself is trying to revise the history that's been written by Heart of Darkness, and Things Fall Apart to a certain extent with her story. So I think that's where you get the title, The Headstrong Historian, from. And Grace is certainly the historian, and Ngwamba is certainly headstrong, and I think you have kind of a combination of the two. And Grace, once she takes on her African name at the end. So it's a very interesting story. If you like Adichie, she has a full-length novel called Half a Yellow Sun that's set during the time Nigeria achieved independence in the 1960s and was recently made into a movie. I haven't seen it, so I don't know if it's any good, but it sure sounds interesting. The last of the three short stories that's very clearly a post-colonial story is Salman Rushdie's In the South. Rushdie's one of the most, if not the most famous post-colonial writers, primarily for his novels Midnight's Children, which is set at the time of Indian independence, and the Satanic Verses, which were published in 80 and 88 and won the Booker Prize, and I believe Midnight's Children also won the Best of the Booker. So he's a really renowned author. Married Padma, the host of Top Chef. If you watch Top Chef, that marriage didn't last long. But just a great, really terrific, really fun writer. I would highly recommend moving on to his novels if you have time and you never take a post-colonial lit class. Take a post-colonial lit class if you get the chance. So this is a more recent short story of his called In the South that really gives a snapshot of Rushdie's writing. And one of the things he always does in his writing is construct usually two main characters as opposites. So here, obviously, you have Junior and Senior, and I think Rushdie does this to play with binaries. It's not always directly East and West because it's always two characters or people, and they don't necessarily symbolize both, but in challenging these binary constructions, I think he's hinting at the larger binary construction of East and West that he's challenging, because Junior and Senior are only born 17 days apart. And the crux of the story, to me, the emotional driving force that makes the story compelling, is that these two old men become friends as they're old men and really have no one else left, and they act like they hate each other, and they seem to have everything about them, as Rushdie gives us more details about their lives, seems to be the opposite, but in the end we realize they're much more similar than they even realized, and they're really great friends. And so he constructs the characters as binaries intentionally and then challenges that construction through the course of the story, and this is a common trope in Rushdie's work. Especially Satanic Verses, which is a favorite of his. The title may seem misleading. It's a great novel if you have a chance to read it. So age comes into play here as another form of otherness. You don't see a lot of stories about elderly people, just as you don't always see stories about, say, disabled people or something. And so the elderly are certainly constructed as the other oftentimes culturally, and you see the characters here both kind of embracing that at times, when Junior's intentionally mean to the clerk who's cashing his check because he can be, and also other times where it's negative. But Rushdie certainly understands the stereotypes and plays with them. Both characters have these different attitudes toward death, and they seem to death is coming close. So if we had more time, or if you want to in your poster on the paper, looking more in depth at their attitudes toward death would be a worthwhile endeavor. But then, of course, you have Junior's death, the day he fell. And this is where irony comes into play. Now, the fact that they're, always talking about death and wanting to die, and then Junior happens to die isn't necessarily irony. The timing of it isn't irony. Irony is a very misunderstood concept. That's a coincidence. Irony is where one situation seems to be the case, but there's actually a different situation going on beneath the surface. And so the irony isn't that they always talk about death and then Junior dies. The irony is they always talk about wanting to die, and then when Junior does die, Senior is very mournful. Junior's death reveals the truth is that they did not actually want to die that soon. And that's the irony of it. And to me, that's what makes the story both tragic and sad, but also beautiful. And this happened, the natural disasters, interesting here. I can't help think about things like Hurricane Katrina when I read this, and the trembling, the shaking of the ground, as the Vespa or the moped knocks Junior over and he dies, and then you have the actual earthquake, and somehow Senior survives it. Or not earthquake, but tsunami, and so with earthquake-like effects. And so, there's kind of this parallel here. What happens to Junior is kind of a microcosm of the larger tragedy that's to come for the whole community or nation. And that's a very interesting, significant element, again, worth pursuing further. Last thing I'll mention here before we move on to the final story is the different classes of society. So, obviously you have the East/West theme, but Rushdie goes into so much more here. You have working and upper classes, especially in the story, the old and the young, the North and the South within the country of India here. So the different parts of the country, the regionalism that emerges, and obviously the religious differences, especially at the end when Senior references Junior's friend who's a Christian. So a lot of disparate parts of society that could be constructed as opposites to each other. And so Rushdie really shows the pervasiveness of the concept of otherness here and challenges it with the way he reveals the similarities between Junior and Senior after Junior's death. But it's a good kind of, as the most recent published of these three stories, it's a good way to transition into the topic of otherness in places beyond post-colonial texts. And so along that line, we have Lehane's story, Animal Rescue. This is a personal favorite of mine. I think I tacked it on just because I wanted to put it in some place, but it really does address the concept of otherness and not in a post-colonial environment. So it serves a really significant purpose here too. It's an interesting story. Lehane's one of my favorite authors. He wrote several books that are great books that have been made into movies. Mystic River, Gone Baby Gone, and Shutter Island have all been made into movies so far that have won awards and whatnot, and his novel Live by Night is also in the process of being adapted. He's from Boston. His stories are always set there and have kind of a noir feel to them. If you're into that kind of story, you might want to look at more of his work. Animal Rescue is an interesting case, though, because he wrote it as a short story. I actually saw him speak about this at the Poison Pen bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, when I was still living in Arizona. but it was optioned to be made into a movie, and so it's a short enough story. The movie actually goes into too much more depth, but still they weren't able to fit everything in the film he wrote for a screenplay. So then after the film, he wrote kind of a short novel. I think it's like just under 300 pages. That is like the screenplay turned into a novel. So the short story really became much more. Obviously, in a class like this, we only have room for the short story, or time for the short story. The film is called The Drop, and the subsequent short novel is called that. You may have seen it or have heard of it. And it's very good. Now that I've read the story and seen the film, they're both very good. And it stars a favorite actor of mine, Tom Hardy, but also James Gandolfini in his final film performance. And he really brings a lot to Marv's character, Marv is really just a very minor character in the short story, becomes a major one in the film. And James Gandolfini does a great job as Marv. There's a part where Bob is talking about the dog and what he should do when he's first adopting the dog, who has a different name in the film other than Cassius, and Marv says something like, "It's just a dog. It's not like some long-lost relative showed up at your doorstep with a colostomy bag. It's just a dog." And I've edited some profanity out there, but if you watch the film, Lehane wrote the dialogue, and it's great. Anyway, on to the story. So you have Bob, Nadia, Eric, and Marv are really the only human characters we see. And these are all otherized characters living on the periphery of society. Bob is an unattractive, middle-aged, unmarried man. And if we had more time, we could go into all of these, but I'd like you to save some of that for the discussion board. So how are these characters otherized? Not normal, so to speak, characters. And Lehane likes to do this, to take characters who kind of live on the periphery of society, who are outsiders, and make them into his protagonists. Cassius's role is very important. I mean, the story is called Animal Rescue. One of the things I think is interesting about this story is, in many ways, the dog, the non-human character, is like the main character. The critical theory lesson last time we talked about non-human animals. There's certainly the other. A dog is man's best friend, but he's also culturally constructed to be very different from man. Again, to teach us more about man, right? A dog, can't control his sexual urges, so he digs under the fence to get out. But humans are supposed to be able to control our impulses. And so we're differentiated through discourse from other species. But with Cassius in this story, Lehane really shows how humans and animals are not that different, and how important animals can be to humans. Cassius tells us more about these other characters that are listed above than anyone else or anything else does in this. So the differences between characters emerge, and they're kind of underscored or outlined by Cassius. And there becomes kind of a hierarchy. These characters all, so to speak, are on a level playing field to begin with, or they could be theoretically, because they're all kind of battered, beaten, weathered characters who tread the line between criminality and whatever the opposite of that is. They all break the law, but none of them are outright villains, so to speak. And so Lehane takes this group of otherized outsiders, and it creates kind of a society here. There aren't really any characters in this story that we would consider normal, so to speak, by society standards. And so in his Island of Misfit Toys here, Lehane develops a hierarchy where he clearly shows a preference for other characters over others. And so Bob is obviously at the top of that. Eric is depicted as a really despicable character. But if society just looked at their transgressions outside of context, they wouldn't be that different. And so the fact that Bob kills Eric at the end is, I wouldn't want to say downplay, but it's treated, I would say, to a certain extent as acceptable in the context of this story. So what makes Bob's killing of Eric acceptable, so to speak? Well, what defines it as acceptable is that Nadia chooses to be with Bob. So specifically after, they're not really together, but after he kills Eric, they end up together. So, and it's certainly not because he killed him. It's not like Nadia will never be threatened by this guy again, but she's not with Bob out of gratitude for killing the guy that abused her. So why does she choose to be with him, I think, is one of the best questions in the story. And the fact that Hohner sets the story up in a way to pose that question can tell us a lot about the human condition and the human spirit. And what role does Cassius play in this? There's a great scene in the movie, near the end of the movie, where it's not really covered in the story as much, but where Nadia shows up to talk to Bob the first time after he kills Eric. And she keeps looking at Cassius and then back at Bob and is seeing what Cassius is doing. And something about the fact that Cassius is still with this guy and loving him after he's killed Eric for some reason makes Nadia feel like it's okay. And I think that has to do a lot with the personality of these two characters. Bob is a killer, but he's a killer no one sees coming. Eric is not afraid of Bob at all. Bob seems like a gentle giant, and then Eric is the wannabe killer who's all talk, but beats up women and animals. And so, by showing the dog comfortable with one but not the other, Hohner's making a very clear statement here. And even though the statement's kind of obvious, there's a lot to dig in with there. So talking about this story in a paper or post, or if you do want to write about it in your paper, going on and reading the film or the novel, you're welcome to do that too. One last theme that emerges here that's more present in the short story than the movie is confidence and control. Bob is a character who may be suicidal, it seems like at the beginning, who is clearly lonely, clearly lacks confidence, the confidence to believe Nadia will be able to stay with him. And when he takes Cassius's chain off the end, it says he could get hit by a car, he could run away, Bob can't control these things. But he seems to be accepting that he can't control them at the end, and that could lead to a confidence he hasn't had before potentially. And that's a really interesting theme I don't think the movie explores as much. The movie goes more into the hierarchy of the characters and the acceptance of the killing, etc. But either way, you have these otherized characters, and you have this non-human character, also an other, who helps reveal things to us about these otherized characters. So it makes for a very interesting study of otherness, Animal Rescue does, that is not set in a post-colonial country. So pick one of the three post-colonial stories and talk about how it challenges conceptions of otherness, and then focus in on how otherness plays out in Animal Rescue and discuss both of those things in the discussion board. I ask a lot of questions when talking about Animal Rescue, and I think because it's just such a fascinating story. So you don't necessarily need to answer every single one of those in the Animal Rescue section of the question, but be sure to discuss the concept of otherness in it, as well as in one of the three post-colonial stories.